Hi, and a very warm welcome to today's webcast in partnership with Infinera. This webcast will look at OTN switching and what the future holds for this network technology, which first saw adoption in the 2000s. Deployments then began to accelerate alongside the adoption of 100G coherent optics in the early 2010s, but since then the industry landscape has evolved quite dramatically. While some OTN transport functions remain relevant for today's networks, service providers are also exploring ways to migrate from legacy designs to more modern, distributed and open architectures. This webcast will explore the latest research findings, as well as the trade-offs and benefits of some of these architectures. I'm Keely Portway, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator today. And I'm even more delighted to be joined by our expert panel of speakers. So we have Tim Dewarren, Vice President, Solutions Marketing at Infinera. We have Sterling Perrin, Senior Principal Analyst, Optical Networks and Transport at Heavy Reading. And we have Walid Wakim, CTO, Systems and Network Solutions at Infinera. Just a note in terms of format, we'll have a presentation from our three speakers, which will then be followed by a live question and answer section. You can submit your questions as we go through the webinar. You don't need to wait until the end, just use the box at the bottom and we'll ask them all at the end. Send them as they occur to you, so don't worry about waiting. So that's me, and without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Tim. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Keely, for the great introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining us here, and thanks to Fibre Systems. Also, thanks to my fellow presenters, some of which are on the road traveling around the globe, Walid in particular. So thanks, Walid, and Sterling as well. I'm going to advance here real quick. I have just 4 slides I want to go through at the beginning of our session here to just set up, kind of the journey of where we've come from before we start talking about where we want to go to, or how we want to transform the network going forward. So just to level set everyone, we began this journey really with the G.709 specification all the way back, hard to believe, but all the way back in the 2001 kind of time frame. That spec really frames out things like the digital wrapper itself and how we're going to containerize our transmissions, how we're going to do OAM and operational and maintenance aspects, forward error correction, bit rates, and client to transmission side mapping. And that was all around really OTN transmission, if you will. Then we kind of later decided that, hey, it'd be kind of nice in the electrical domain if we could switch these OTN containers and be able to multiplex them and switch them from client and line side interfaces. And so kind of the initial OTN switches were born with hundreds of gigs to maybe a terabit of capacity. But along came 100 gig coherent transmission around the 2010 timeframe. And that really kind of accelerated what was happening from an OTN switching perspective. And if you look at today's OTN switches, we have varying sizes of capacities in the network, large ones being in the 24 to 64 terabit range, medium capacity switches, say, being 12 to 24, and then of course smaller size switches along with appliances as well. And I'm going to build this slide out here because I want to talk about the functions first. So if we take a look at an OTN switch, we've got a collection of interfaces, generally low speed interfaces, and we also have higher speed interfaces generally on the line side. So we're taking client traffic of various types and capacities, and we're switching that either amongst the client ports themselves, or we're switching it over to line side where we can do longer distance transmission. So what are the functions involved in that then? So we have any-to-any switching, We have support for both Ethernet and kind of legacy SONET SDH interfaces and their transmission. While there is support for synchronization or synchronous transmission, OTN doesn't require network synchronization. And application-wise, part of why we did this was, look, at the time, coherent interfaces are expensive, routing ports are expensive, and so if we can use those coherent interfaces, if we can use those routing port interfaces efficiently, that's certainly beneficial from an economics and from a networking capability perspective. We've also used OTN switching as kind of this metro to long haul gateway function, quite common use case and still exists to bridge us between the long haul and the metro networks. And then, transparent services, quite common to put over this infrastructure, low speed private line services or high speed private line services, the definition of which has changed over time. We'll talk about that a little later. And so the benefits from all this are, look, I have this electrical switching flexibility. I gain some operational simplicity and some consistency, and also protection and restoration for high reliability and resiliency are certainly a part of that. So what does this look like from a networking perspective? And again, we're looking at, kind of the journey we've come from. And the design that we ultimately put in place is one that's really designed around kind of an any-to-any connectivity. And this is, pre-data center connectivity and pre-data center build-outs. And so the traffic pattern is one of kind of going everywhere. And we end up designing the network in part to support that kind of any-to-any connectivity. If we were to lay this out in somewhat of a layered model format, this is kind of what it looks like. We have low speed and high speed private line services heading over our OTN switching domain and our OTN switches. Our internet layer 2, layer 3 VPN services, obviously headed over the router infrastructure. At one point, we could have taken that green line, if I went far enough back, and said, hey, there's OTN switching underlying all of this. But over time, of course, less of the router-based services or less of that traffic headed over the OTN switching and instead headed through a gray optic to colored optic or DWDM coherent optic through muxponder type of technology. But you kind of get a base here of where are we or where were we from a forward progression. And this is going to set us up for a discussion now about, where do we go from this kind of being, we'll call it the traditional or somewhat legacy architecture. With that, and before we talk about the future, Infinera engaged heavy reading, and in particular Sterling, last year to get some quantifiable data in addition to qualitative data about what do service providers think about their current network and future network and what's happening with that network to bring that outside in view and make that available. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sterling, and he'll walk us through some of the findings from the independent research that they conducted and we sponsored. Sterling?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to Fibre Systems for hosting this webinar. As Tim indicated, we at Heavy Reading conducted a survey last year on the topic of OTN and looking at the future and the migration. It's an area that I've covered for decades, really, so it was interesting to view it in the scope of a technology that is, really trying to understand its future going forward, because there was a lot of activity early in the 2000 and 2010s, and then it was kind of there, and now we're at a point where we want to see, how are operators thinking about that. So that was the basis of the survey, to understand the value proposition, challenges, and migration plans around switched OTN. So we conducted the survey in July 2023. We had 117 network operators, so this is really, telecom network operators. And geographically, you can see the mix on the right of who we solicited for the survey. Typically, our surveys have a larger North American component, where OTN is a technology that's really entrenched in a lot of regions outside North America. We wanted more representation around the world. So North America is 74% outside. And almost half of the operators were $1 billion or more in annual revenue. So we definitely wanted to get a view of large operators. We did do a white paper, a heavy reading I authored the white paper. It is published and available for download as well. So and so the data I'm going to go through here are really the points that we highlighted in the white paper itself. So we asked, what are the main benefits of using switched OTN in the network? We know it's well entrenched in networks globally, and so we wanted to understand what are the top reasons for continuing to do it. And not really a surprise for us, the ability to deliver premium private line guarantees, topping the list, is the biggest benefit of switched OTN. So these are high quality of service, deterministic latency, traffic separation, really hard separation of traffic in the network, security, all of these things that go along with higher priced private lines, topping the list. Again, we expected that. What was interesting and surprising really for us was the second one that came on as a benefit, which is, we call it preserving the network status quo. Basically, the fact that OTN switching is a legacy network technology. It's entrenched in the network, and operators strongly view a primary benefit of OTN is really the fact that it's already in the network and understood. We knew that would be in the mix, but it was definitely a surprise at how strongly a benefit that is still considered to be for OTN technology. So we wanted to get into, so we know OTN is a strong underpinning for private line services. So we wanted to get an understanding of where operators are with private line services, both low speed and high speed private line. And we define these as low speed, we defined as 10 gig services and below, and high speed private lines. In this question and other questions, we define high speed private lines as greater than 10 gigs. So primarily would be 100 gig services and moving to 400 gig and beyond on the high speed side. We are seeing in the data that's shown here, expectations for growth, annual growth, shifting away from low speed towards more high speed, which I suppose you would expect to be the trend. And here's data showing that this is exactly what operators think will happen in the future for their services. So greater than 10 gig growing, while the 10 gig and below more anticipating decline. 58% expecting high-speed private line services to grow versus 51% expecting lower speed to grow. That's the candles on the right. And then if you go on the far left, 27% expecting their low speed to decline annually, whereas only 20% expecting the high speed to decline. And other research, bears this out. Omdia, which is a sister organization within our larger Informa Tech group within our company, does a lot of forecasts, and they're certainly forecasting coherent high-speed interfaces having very strong growth, 400 gig, strong growth, and 800 gig, and even a terabit and beyond. So we have forecast data, we have survey data showing that high speed is where the momentum is in service provider networks. Telecom, again, this is more telecom focused. So clearly there's also challenges to OTN as a technology that's in the network, and at this point a legacy technology. So we wanted to understand better the challenges that network operators are facing with their switched OTN networks. And the top challenges, really two of them came to the top in the survey. The top one being 59%, lack of support for high-speed coherent line interfaces. And again, high speed we're defining as above 10 gigs, so 100 gig, 400 gig and above. 59% saying lack of support for these high-speed interfaces, topping the list of challenges. And again, as we just showed on the previous slide, high-speed interfaces is where the momentum is, the growth in traffic, and also, of course, going with that, the growth in revenue and just customer demand. So that's a significant challenge. The other one that came in at the top 50%, referencing high capital costs. So OTN is an expensive technology to have and maintain in the network, and operators do have concern about that as they look at their networks going forward. There was also another set of challenges that came in. You know, as we look at these types of surveys, we call this more of a second tier. We would group those under the umbrella of basically legacy operational challenges. Operators are concerned by high vendor support fees, complexity of operations, high power consumption, and large footprint also high on the list. These are things you would expect to be more and more an issue of something that's a legacy technology in the network. And of course, as we look at, you know, the trends around the world in sustainability and really focusing on power consumption, you know, some of these issues, power consumption and footprint, I think will only become more of an issue over time as operators look at their migration strategies. And so this brings us to where to go forward and how to view switched OTN. And again, we focus really on switched OTN as opposed to, as Tim explained in the very beginning, OTN as a framing and a transport line in the network is different from a switched infrastructure. And we're really focusing on what are you doing with that switching function going forward. So we asked about plans to either cap or remove switched OTN in their network going forward. And you can see here we gave a number of years over which they may make those decisions. We actually asked this as two separate questions. One, plans to cap, one, plans to remove. For just comparison purposes, we grouped them here in a single chart to show, because I think it's enlightening to show how they're viewing both of them kind of together. Cap and grow is the preferred near-term migration strategy that operators have for switched OTN. We were surprised at the level of interest really in the cap and grow strategy. We knew it would factor in, but the level that we got back in this data was actually quite surprising. 82% of operators surveyed expecting that they would cap their investments in OTN, switched OTN, by end of 2025. And just if you look kind of over on the far part of the graphic, 11%, only 11% reporting that they have no plans to cap. So certainly this tells us that operators are looking at how to move forward in their network, and they're really scrutinizing their switched OTN. And based on the survey, a lot of them, the vast majority of them really expecting a cap and growth strategy to switched OTN. The other question we asked about was removing OTN switching, and you would expect, and it shows here in the data, that operators would, you know, first cap their investments, and then when things hit end of life, they would move to remove those from the network, and that generally shows through here. It is also surprising, though, the level of interest in removing switched OTN from the network. 2/3, 67%, anticipating that they would have removed OTN switching from their network by the end of 2025. In terms of the already done component, you can see almost nobody, 1%, saying they've done it. And clearly, it's a technology that's here, but this is looking forward at what operators are anticipating going forward for their network. So we have cap and grow, and we have removal very much on the minds of the operators surveyed. And so then we wanted to get a little bit more detail into how operators are using OTN switching for private line services, and then also, as I'll show on the next slide, what types of services they're offering that do not run over the switched OTN. So first, let's look at how operators are delivering private line services in the network. And also here we segmented the same way we did in the earlier question: low speed services 10 gig and below, high speed greater than 10 gig. And a number of technology options for offering private line services. Switched OTN came through as a strong option for lower speed services, 44%. That's the candles there on the far left. 44% using OTN switching for their low speed services. And this is something you would expect, as Tim gave a bit of an explanation in the beginning, when you have lots of traffic kind of aggregating and going in deeper in the network towards the core, you get larger and larger pipes. And for financial reasons, economics, you want to pack those pipes as full and efficiently as possible, and OTN has served to do that. So taking lower speed OTN traffic or private line service in the network, running it over OTN, and then just kind of packing it more and more as it goes deeper in the network. So that shows through in this question. As we look at high-speed services, though, it does show a bit of a difference, which we highlight here. As you look at the higher speed private line services, operators are more likely to favor an add-drop multiplexer or an exponder approach to high-speed services. Almost half of them, 48%, using ADMs or expanders for their high-speed private line services. Exponder is a term that we used in the report as kind of a catch-all for either a transponder, which is kind of like coming in and going out, 100 gig in, 100 gig out. It also would include a muxponder, which is kind of a simple level aggregation function of taking a couple lower speed services in and multiplexing them out to a higher speed. And then it also includes, as Infinera will talk in more detail, a switch sponder function, which is basically taking some level of switching and distributing it down further in the network. So we didn't parse out, which preferred among them here for this question, but generally for higher speed services, some level of that function is strongly favored for a higher speed private line compared to a lower speed. The other one thing I'll point out here, lastly, is circuit emulation, which is a technology in use today. However, for private line services, operators largely are not using it today, either for low speed or high speed private line services. So that's kind of a picture of what things look like today. The other point I wanted to get into, as I alluded on the last slide, is what types of services are operators running that bypasses or does not use a switched OTN network? And that's what this question is getting at. And here we see 100 gig leased lines being the number one service that an operator would offer outside of an OTN, switched OTN network. 50% saying they offer their 100 gig lease lines outside of switched OTN, and actually a very strong showing as well for 10 gig lease lines, 45%, almost half, running their 10 gig lease lines not over the switched OTN line. So, this makes sense, particularly on the higher speed services as well, where you may have no grooming whatsoever required, in which case you're kind of running a point to point, and you may not, in this case, OTN would be inefficient, not really doing anything. So we're seeing that as you move to the higher speeds as well. The last point I'll make on this slide is 400 gig lease lines certainly fits the bucket of higher capacity service. You would expect that to run the trend of not requiring an OTN network. Our read on this one, and we did another survey a year ago that looked at 400 gigs specifically, it ranks in the middle of the pack here, a little bit counterintuitive, but we believe that's because it's just not very common yet. We think most operators and survey data bears this out. It's very new for telecom as a service offering, and certainly as a lease line or wavelength service. So operators we think just don't have it yet. We do expect, as that becomes more entrenched, that would also be the type of service that you would not require OTN switching for, because it certainly just doesn't make sense given the value of what switched OTN is doing in the network. The very last slide here I've pulled from the white paper and from the survey is looking at private line emulation. I talked a little bit about circuit emulation a couple slides back. We know it's not used strongly today. Private line emulation is a specific technology that's standardized by the IETF, and it's taking a circuit emulation and it's applying it to higher speed services, and specifically using circuit emulation for a high-speed private line as an option to do that. It's an important technology. We've been following it a bit. It is new. And so we wanted to get a sense of private line emulation and how and if operators are thinking about that, because it can be an alternative to a switched OTN infrastructure for these types of services, certainly. So a couple findings from this that I'll highlight. One of them, just really the big picture, is that operators, even though Circuit M is not really used today for private line, operators definitely showed a willingness for private line emulation in general. So that's the kind of the top level finding. And then also within that, it's and Tim and Waleed will go into more detail in kind of the hows of it, but there's a couple different ways that you can implement private line emulation in a network, either directly in the router, which has been kind of the more way Circuit M has been rolled out to date, or you can take that function and build it into a DWDM transport box. So there's two different options. The technology itself, private line emulation as a standard, is new. So we wanted to get a sense of if they have a preference one way or the other architecture-wise, and 81% of respondents indicating they would implement it either in transport or in a router equipment. So not really showing any overwhelming demand for router only or even transponder or WDM equipment transport based. Either is an option. They are interested in the technology, but it is quite new, and I think there needs to be a lot, more market development, certainly maturity and just education as the market understands more about this technology. But we do think it's interesting, and it was encouraging for me that operators are certainly open to it based on the survey. So that was a quick run through of some of the key findings. It was a wider survey. We had other data as well, but these are the ones that we really brought forth in the white paper. And as I said, that white paper is available today if you want to read further. And with that, I believe I hand things back, Tim, to you to get into some more of the details around architectures.
Yeah, perfect, Sterling. Thanks a lot. Enjoyed walking through that with you and hitting the high points of the research. Sure. Sterling mentioned the papers being available. There's actually two papers, and at the end of this presentation, we have a slide that has links to both of these that can be downloaded from Infinera.com, and we'll publish these slides after the webinar. And then when you get to that final slide in the deck, you'll be able to click on the link to make it easy for you to access those two reports, the one from heavy reading, and then the other, a paper that is really kind of the collection of information here in these slides published by Infinera. So we've talked about our journey from OTN in 2001 to the advent of OTN switching, and we've moved forward a little bit in time with our reference. Now we've also gotten a perspective from Sterling about what our service provider, network operator attitudes and thoughts, and what's top of mind for them as they look forward to their network architecture. Now we're going to shift the topic just a little bit and talk about, so since we began this OTN switching journey, what has changed? What has transpired? What's happened both from a technology perspective, but also from a behavior and a services perspective? And so I'll walk through some of those slides, and then I'll hand over to Waleed, and he's going to walk us through some network modeling, real-world network modeling, and talk about some of the findings from that modeling before we wrap this part up and head to the Q&A. So what changed since 2010 versus 2024? Well, one of the big changes is significant investment and scale in terms of network processors or in terms of IP routing silicon. Think about things like Jericho 3 as an example. which has a 28.8 terabit per second capacity when you marry it with a Raman 3 fabric. Also, Ethernet switching. Think about inside the data center, or switches for that kind of application. We've moved to 51.2 terabits from a merchant silicon switching, Ethernet switching capacity. I'll jump down to coherent optics. Coherent optics went from 100 gig large vertical line card with a certain amount of power and 65 nanometer DSP, and maybe 100 gig coherent optic that could go 100, 200 kilometers. Since then, we all know we've made a big leap forward. We're staring at 800 gig pluggables, 400 and 800 gig pluggables, 1 terabit plus embedded coherent engines, and reaches that go 10,000, 12,000 kilometers and more for high capacity waves. So significant transformation there. But then if we step back up to the merchant OTN switch silicon, less forward progress in terms of bigger capacities being available. We're at 1.2 terabit type of silicon. And over the last, probably since 2018 or so, we haven't seen much change, I'll say there. And so what you see is the IP Ethernet silicon and coherent engines, I would argue, advancing rapidly and less so on the OTN merchant silicon path. And let's take a look at that a little bit in the next slide. So I just tried to put 2 graphics up here. And on the left side, we see the jump from 14.4 to 28.8 with 2023 kind of advancement in network processors. And on the right-hand side, I was just playing with some math around, capacity of wave, the reach of the wave, and what does that look like per unit cost, a euro, a dollar, or of course, any other currency. And the main point, of course, is that has changed a lot. And rough math in the 200 to 300 kind of improvement when you play that out. In short, we're getting more transmission capacity, we're sending it further, and we're getting a much better price point on that is really the result of that message. What else has changed since 2010? Well, one is routers and routing itself. So if we're going to take that network processing unit and Ethernet switch silicon, and we're going to apply it to creating routers from appliances to larger core routing devices, we have the results of routers that are 500 plus terabits of capacity, 15 plus terabits per rack unit, and power significantly down, where we're at about 0.1 watt per gigabit or less. And if we compared that to where we are from our current state of OTN switching products, you'd generally expect to see up to 64 terabits of capacity, maybe 1 terabit per rack unit, and something like 0.4 watts per gigabit. And again, just a reflection of kind of that investment and that evolution of that silicon OTN versus Ethernet switching and network processor unit for the network routing. The other thing that's changed is also the software for the routers has gotten more capable, more sophisticated, with more deterministic quality of service, and things like circuit style segment routing. What it means for us is the routing platform can be a platform for delivery of really all packet services, certainly has the potential for that. And it competes with the OTN switching for strong SLA and delivery. All right. What about router interconnect and how we're connecting routers together? Well, if we go back far enough, right, the OTN switching was underlaying the routing infrastructure. And then either directly out of the OTN switch, we had the coherent optics, or in the original case, not coherent, but just DWDM optics. So we had the line side or DWDM optic, or we take a gray optic out of the switch, we connect it to a separate transponder, muxponder type of module, and then provide that. If we move to the middle, in the middle case, because the router port speeds are increasing, and because we have the ability to bypass that OTN switching infrastructure, we see the router going directly to, with gray optics, to a transponder muxponder, which does the translation to the DWDM or line side of the transmission. Of course, today we have pluggable optics, pluggable coherent optics in QSFP-DD packages and CFP2 packages. And so IP over DWDM is beginning to happen, of course, more in the ICPs, internet content providers, than the CSPs, but certainly communication service providers are moving in this direction as well. And so we see a mix, right, of the transponder muxponder technology for line side coherent interfaces, along with pluggable optics available as well. What else has changed? Well, if we look at network traffic that years ago may have been completely OTN based traffic, and if we apply a reasonable growth rate to that traffic, holistically, the IP traffic and the OTN traffic, and we apply that growth rate, but the OTN growing slower, which certainly we see evidence of that when we look at the data. What happens is, over a series of years, you see what used to be 100% OTN traffic moving steadily down as a percent of the overall network. And so at one point, 100%, 8 years later, is now 20% of the traffic, with the other 80% being dominated by non-OTN traffic. Think about IP traffic. Think about high-speed private line services that aren't going through the OTN switching fabric, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So as we take a look at that, and we take a look at the traffic patterns, which back in the original slides we talked about setting up a switched OTN network that had an any-to-any connectivity, and we had OTN switching underlying everything. Fast forward to today, and today we have data centers. We have lots of data centers beginning to emerge. Hyperscale ones started, and now modular and compact ones. But our traffic is going more in a hub and spoke manner, less of an any-to-any manner, and more of our traffic is IP over wavelengths, whether those wavelengths were launched from a pluggable optic in the router, or whether those wavelengths are in a muxponder. But increasingly, the traffic pattern is IP over wavelengths and hub and spoke, versus where we came from with an any-to-any and a OTN layer there. Again, the majority of the traffic being now hub and spoke and IP. So what does that look like if we were to draw this network diagram, and how could we use small OTN switching devices? Sterling mentioned it already. We'll call it switch sponders, and muxponders. Muxponder being, we could take 10 gig client interfaces and mux those into 100 gig wave, as an example. How could we think about altering the network and changing it? Well, we could use these small blades or sleds with a small amount of OTN switching capacity relative to a large chassis. And if we deployed those at the edge of the network and at the aggregation sites, we would have an opportunity to do localized OTN switching at the edge of the network, and that would then not have to transport that traffic back. So think client to client type of switching, or client to line. We also can bring that traffic back and aggregate it with a lower speed OTN wavelength. And at this aggregation site, we can then aggregate into higher speed waves that we see going on the right-hand side with the darker black. And so we have an opportunity to do localized OTN switching, but also express traffic where appropriate in order to fill up wavelengths and get the services mapped into the wavelengths efficiently. And we would generally use the switch bonder technology for lower speed type of switching. And with that, we could use a combination of switch bonder and mux bonder technology to do that. So what does that look like from a network diagram versus a block diagram versus the one we had before? High-speed private line services. Think about 100 gig transparent or wave service going into a 400 gig line, right? High-speed private line services. Send over the X-bonder back to Sterling Survey. We talked about X-bonder, which is, in this case, we're talking mux bonder, switch bonder type of functionality. Switch bonder where we need the switching, mux bonder where we just need to multiplex it up and send it on a wave. The low speed private line services we would send through the switch bonder functionality. And then I show a line to the router because circuit emulation, we could use that for some of the lower speed traffic, private line service traffic as well, and run that to the router. We saw a small percentage of that going on. And so it's this combination of mux bonder, switch bonder technology we refer to as X bonder that we think can help us build a more cost-effective network here. And let me show you that just functional comparison. So an OTN mux bonder, what are we doing? Cost-effective, low power, small footprint, lower speed interfaces going to a higher speed wave interface. Traditional OTN switching, we generally have a switch fabric. We have a series of line cards. We have the ability to switch across that. It gives us the any-to-any switching, gives us some granularity and flexibility, but it also comes at a cost, power, space, and economics. So could we get the best of both worlds, as someone named Sammy Hagar once said in the song, by the way, with an OTN switch bonder? And in that case, we can get the any-to-any switching, the granularity, the flexibility, but we could also do it at a more cost-effective, lower power and smaller footprint. And let's just take a look at how that would scale if we put that into a network. Traditional OTN switching would have a fabric, backplane, interface line cards. We're talking about a switch bonder going into a compact modular platform as one of the sleds. If we needed another switch bonder or more capacity for that low speed switching, we can do that by adding another one, another switch bonder. And then we also have the ability to do multi-chassis stackability, and we would stack multiple compact modular chassis together in a single network element. And in the traditional case, of course, we'd add additional line cards to that. And so OTN switch bonder gives you this kind of low upfront cost, low space, low power, and enables some cost-effective scaling here. I have two more slides here before handing over to Waleed. We mentioned private line emulation, which is kind of a successor to circuit emulation, but for higher speed services. Another step in kind of the network journey could be that you take even the higher speed services, in this case, we'll call it 10 gig and 100 gig, and you could transparently, you could deliver a transparent service through private line emulation to take that traffic over your converged packet or IP infrastructure. That is another potential step in the journey of the network. And in fact, we had a demonstration at the OFC conference in San Diego back in March, where we collaborated with Intel and Juniper to take an OTU4 interface and PLE that, if you will, and put that into a transparent service delivery over, in this case, a Juniper router and across our line system and back out on the other side. So we mapped OTU4 to 400 gig transparent service. With all of that said, you know, what does the data say, and what does the modeling say, and why do we think this makes sense? And I'm going to hand it over to Waleed, who's going to walk us through that next part.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim, and as well Sterling and Keeley Fibre Systems, and everybody who's joined the call. A lot of good information here on the technology and some trends that the industry is moving in. But what becomes interesting is, why do I want to move in that direction? What is it I'm trying to achieve with my network? And when we start looking at the actual network modeling, what we want to do is figure out, you know, am I trying to optimize cost, power, real estate? Am I trying to optimize capacity? What we need to do in order to achieve this is to look at some open tooling. We want to be able to actually go out and model and design networks in an open manner, so that we can actually look and see what is the right optimization for you and your networks. So what did we do? We've ended up developing multiple tools which help you enable looking at your network differently. You can actually import your network, import your traffic. You can run multiple aggregation techniques, from centralized core switch OTN switching to distributed OTN switching, from using optical bypass to using hop-to-hop technology to do a hybrid. And running those designs, you can then take that data and you can feed it into a comparison engine, where a comparison engine will look at your cost, your power, your real estate, carbon emissions, and you have to be able to meet the SLAs for your end customer. In doing so, it will actually compare network level availability at the same time down to the service level. What the goal of the tooling was to enable the ability to look at your network and decide for yourself, what is the best architecture for me to move forward? Once we built the actual design engines and once we did the actual compare engines, we needed to ensure SLAs can be met as well. So what we did was build open wave resiliency evaluator as well. And what this does is goes out and it simulates availability of your network. It simulates the number of events that can take place in your network, the number of simultaneous failures that can take place in your network, and leveraging different protection and restoration schemes based on the architectures that you define. Have it centralized OTN, have it distributed OTN, have it hop-to-hop. As those networks that you're evaluating, it will go out and it will compute the availability of those networks, accounting for L0, L3 protection mechanisms, or a hybrid protection mechanism. Do I want to do restoration? Do I want to do 1+1+R? How am I building out my network? This becomes the fundamental step in deciding what is the right architecture. We've shown the trends, but do those trends apply to you? Is the key question that needs to be answered. In order to do that, we need the proper tools in order to demonstrate what the true value of the different approaches and the different architectures and technologies bring to you as the network operator. So what we did was we took this tool and we did real network comparisons and modeling. We looked at a traditional approach of an OTN switch, centralized OTN switching, where I put a big dedicated OTN switch fabric in my locations across my network, and I use them as aggregation, et cetera. And then I looked at what I call distributed OTN where you need it, OTN switch bounder cards, where you need those cards to be placed, and where you optimally place them. And then we looked at what we feel to be some of the key concerns on our customer's mind: power, space, and cost. By modeling these networks, we needed to capture what are the true savings. Does it make sense to do architecture A or architecture B? So what we did was we took actual networks, and what we did was scattered those networks across different regions of the globe. And what we fed it was real traffic data. That real traffic data was then leveraged in order to compute the optimal routing across the network, the aggregation technique across the network, optical performance. Based on those three key parameters, we then computed cost, power, and real estate. At the end of that, we did a network availability analysis at the same time. One of these networks was a European-based network, and I apologize, I'm not allowed to give, of course, the customer names. These networks are done in conjunction with different customers. This one network was a European-based network, 75 nodes, 5,700 kilometers of fiber, approximately 23 terabits of traffic, and a mixture of client services from 1 gig all the way up to 400 gig E. And what was interesting in this whole analysis with this customer was we actually took this network from 1 gig all the way up to 400 gig, and the sheer number of nodes and the actual total number of capacity, the 23 terabits, what it ended up showing us was, if I take the blue being the traditional approach and normalize it to be, say, $1 or 100% in this case, that becomes my normalized value. By switching architectures and looking at optimal aggregation and comparing it to the centralized OTN switching, what we found is that with power, you can save in the order of 25% by going to the distributed OTN approach. From a space perspective, you could save actually approximately 64% of space by moving towards a distributed OTN approach, and 32% cost. Now, the first question we ask ourselves, is this specific to this network? Or is this a common phenomenon that we can see? So what we did was we reached out to three other networks, a total of 4 networks in this case here. We've done many, many more. And savings are going to vary according to the traffic types, the distances, et cetera, and the amount of traffic traversing the network. But generally we've seen pretty consistent results. So what we looked at was Latin America. We looked at the Middle East. I showed you the European network. And we also looked in APAC region as well. And we looked at varying size networks from 31 nodes and 886 kilometers all the way up to 58 nodes and 11,600 kilometer networks, and anything from 7 terabits to 62.4 terabits per second. And what we found was, in each and every case, we've seen savings in power, we've seen savings in space, and we've seen savings in CapEx. Interestingly, you'll see the variance here of power savings, space savings, and that variance is based on, again, these are real networks. They're not fake networks or test networks. They're actual networks that are built, and each one is built with a different optimization in mind. Each one of our customers have different optimizations that they optimize for. So you'll see that in some cases, for example, space savings in CALA was 80% space savings versus traditional approach, while in the Middle East for this customer, it was 32% savings. That comes to how they build the network and the technology within the network. But overall, what we consistently see is power savings, cost savings, and space savings on all these different networks. One of the key aspects we look at when we define the demand we're defining is the actual demand itself. What is your customer paying for? It's not a wavelength. We're not interested in what the wavelength is or what the interface speed is. What we're interested in is what the actual demand is, because that's what you're getting paid for. You're getting paid for the demand coming in your network and the demand going out of your network. So we focus on the actual demand, not the wavelength, not the interface speed, but the actual demand itself. And when you do that, you end up getting a different view of your network. And it becomes interesting when you see these savings. Again, as I said, consistent savings. We consistently see the savings. These were just 4 networks. The networks we've modeled had expand beyond this, multiple customers, but this is just a snapshot. I wanted to show a variance. I didn't want to show all these fantastic numbers, wanted to show a variance, but the variance still consistently comes up with drastic savings that can be achieved by optimizing the network around distributed OTN and optimal aggregation. Now, when I look overall, we look to build our networks, and we want to optimize our networks around cost, power, and real estate. By doing so, by definition, I end up bringing in network simplification. We tend to get focused a lot on the previous terms because they're nice, they're measurable, I can see it. But network simplification is a key parameter we also need in the network. The more I can remove from my network, the more layers I can remove from my network, the more components I can remove from my network, and the more redundancies I remove from the network, I simplify the network. By simplifying the network, I enable automation in a simpler fashion. In essence, what we were able to show with all the modeling we've completed to date, and the modeling based on industry algorithms from the Gaussian noise model to compute optical feasibility to Dijkstra algorithm for routing to discrete event simulations in order to do network level availability, continually show savings by moving towards an OTN, distributed OTN model, and re-looking at your architecture and moving to fewer devices and removing the legacy platforms from your network or reusing them for low-speed services. As Tim mentioned, there's 2 papers that are published. I just want to point to them here. The heavy reading paper that Sterling referenced, as well as the Infinera paper that Tim referenced. They'll be within the deck with a link that you can go get to those papers. That's with the 2 minutes left. That's hopefully this added value. And if you have any other questions, I ask you, reach out to your Infinera account teams. We'd be more than happy to model your networks together and show any possible optimizations and savings that can be achieved.
Thanks a lot, Waleed. Keely, any questions in the last 2 minutes we have left?
We have time for a couple of questions. So we've had a couple come in. We've got one for you, Tim, actually, and that is, how real is PLE, and when do you think the industry is ready to go there?
So PLE is in, I think Sterling mentioned it, IETF draft form, and there are a collection of participants, I'll just say technology participants in the industry collaborating on it. And I won't predict exactly when it goes mainstream. I've been wrong enough times to know that that takes time. But clearly we were able to demonstrate it. Clearly there's folks putting some investment into it. And by the way, the folks on the phone have a direct correlation on how fast that comes to market. Part of the reason we brought it to OFC was to get feedback from service providers like yourselves here on this call, and love to hear what you think about that. But the technology is maturing and coming along, both with the IETF and with the vendor community.
Thank you. I've got a question for Sterling. Sterling, the question is, are the migration timelines in the survey data realistic?
Yeah, thanks. So we do these surveys a lot. I've been doing it for 20 years on different technology iterations. What we do find is directionally and it's always a different audience, of course, they get it right directionally. The timelines tend to be too aggressive. So when I look at them and it says something's next year, I do not typically bet all in on that's going to happen. But when we see these big migrations and there's a clear showing of an interest among operators, they do it. But for whatever reasons, they do tend to be a little overly aggressive. Part of it's because it's a little bit self-selection, although in this case, we didn't even say, well, OTN migration, people maybe have an interest in migrating, so they'll respond, so that skews it a little bit. And part of it is just the different challenges and kind of selling stuff internally takes more time than operators think. So directionally, we see this as absolute. Timelines, yeah, they tend to slip.
No problem. Thank you ever so much, Sterling. And we can squeeze in one more question, I think, before we wrap up today's webcast. This one's for Waleed. How do you address modelling in multi-vendor networks or environments?
So that's a very good question. I think we have to come to the realization that networks are multi-vendor networks, and all of our tools should enable us to operate in a multi-vendor environment. So by using industry algorithms, industry norm algorithms, and different models that are identified within the industry to define the different components of the network, you're able to model third-party networks, not only vendor-specific models. Again, using like for path computation, we have in our tools a path computation engine where we leverage the industry's Gaussian noise model. We route traffic via Dijkstra algorithm. We do event simulations and failure analysis via DES or discrete event simulations. Today's industry has evolved enough that we can use existing network models being equipment definitions, so device models, etc. We can consume those now, and based on that, we can do multi-vendor environments at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you ever so much. I'm so sorry, everyone, but we're actually, we've reached the end of time for today's webcast. But I just want to say thank you so much again. It's been really, really interesting, and I've really enjoyed listening to it as well. So I'm sure everyone out there watching has too. I just need to, just to let people know, the webcast will remain on demand on the Fibre Systems website, and that'll be for the next 12 months. That's www.fibre-systems.com. And as the guys have said, you can download the material and the white papers as well from the links. Please note on here that the catch-up, you won't be able to participate in the live Q&A, of course. So all that remains for me to do now is to thank again Tim, Sterling and Waleed. Thank you very much to our sponsor, Infinera. Thank you to the Europa Science production team working hard in the background to help this webcast take place. And of course, last but not least, thanks to everyone who's tuned in today. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.